This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza. And right now we're in no man's land. Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said. My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years, reporting for the BBC, Sky and ITN. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I try to provide context and background to a big story in the news by talking to someone with real insight. For this edition, you've probably heard of Bitcoin. You may hear people talking about cryptocurrencies, but do you know how they are mined? And should we worry about them or should we be buying them? As El Salvador becomes the first government in the world to order everyone to accept Bitcoin as payment, it feels like it's time to try and understand a bit more about what they are and how they work. I've been speaking to the distinguished economist, author and broadcaster, Linda Yueh. Linda Yueh, thanks very much for talking to us for this edition of How Did We Get Here? Cryptocurrencies, it's the sort of thing we hear a lot about. Let's go right back to basics. How is a cryptocurrency different to a conventional currency?
Probably in two ways. So the first way is that it's privately issued. So currencies, money, sterling, is typically issued by a government. So the Bank of England issues banknotes, and we're all very familiar with that. A cryptocurrency is privately issued. So it's not issued by a government. It's issued by individuals who create the currency. The second difference is that cryptocurrencies are only digital. So I mentioned there are banknotes. There are no banknotes for cryptocurrencies. There's no coins. It only exists virtually, digitally on the internet.
So you say they're created. I mean, who creates them? Is this just individual entrepreneurs, crooks, people who just feel like I'm going to create a currency now?
Could be created by anyone. In fact, the most widely used cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, no one knows who created that. There is a Japanese name attached to it, but people don't actually know who created Bitcoin. But anyone who can code can create a cryptocurrency. To get it to be used by others is more involved, but not that I'm recommending this, but if you were to Google it, there are websites that offer you a kit for how you would create a currency, how you would get it on one of these virtual exchanges, meaning that it exists online so others know about it. And once it's established, you can mine. So in other words, other people who want to use it. Again, if you know how to code, you could mine for more units of that cryptocurrency. And that's where some of the issues around how energy intensive it is to mine for cryptocurrencies. That's actually where it comes from.
Okay, we'll come back to some of that, but basically a cryptocurrency is a whole lot of computer code. Is that the correct way of looking at it?
Yeah, so because it's like anything which is digital, it is essentially code, and it comes out in a currency, and it's got different names. So Bitcoin is the one that we know the most, but there's obviously a lot of other cryptocurrencies as well.
But if we don't even know who created Bitcoin, for instance, which in itself I still find a kind of mind-boggling thought, how do you create more? Can other people, you talked about mining, does that mean that can other people create there's an amount of Bitcoin, or is there only one centralized way of creating Bitcoin?
So part of the appeal of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies is that there's a set quantity. So in other words, the person who creates it says there's only X number of units. And if you wanted to possess these units rather than say, buy it virtually, you would mine, you would look for the cryptocurrency. So cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin became popular, I would say a few years ago, probably around the banking crisis of a decade ago. And that's when central banks were issuing a lot of money through quantitative easing to try and support the economy. And concerns by those who thought, oh, hang on, that's a lot of money being issued. by governments. I want something that may not be so inflationary. I want something that holds value, and that's why the set quantity of Bitcoin, I think, became appealing. So once you create the cryptocurrency, so as I say, there are kits now to do this. Others who want more units of it could mine it. So they would, again, depends on your ability to do this. You will look for these units on the internet.
So there's a fixed amount that's created. So anyone who's after cryptocurrency, you've got to go looking for it. You can't create it.
Yeah, you can create your own. But if you want to, say, have a unit of Bitcoin, you would mine it. And the appeal is that there's a set quantity.
And it's the mining that takes an awful lot of energy, is that right? Which is why a lot of people are unhappy about the growth of these cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, so I think the mining takes up quite a lot of energy, and it's one of the issues around cryptocurrencies. There are also cryptocurrencies, for instance, one called Stablecoin, and what they do is it's privately issued, but they link it to a government asset. So what they're trying to do is to say, it's not just the quantity of this cryptocurrency. We actually link it to a real asset issued by governments, and that gives it, you can argue that gives it more stability. So anyone who trades in a stable coin isn't just reliant on these private trades. You also know it is linked to a government bond. So there are different versions of this, but they all involve somebody creating cryptocurrency, having a set amount, and other people who either want to trade it or they mine it. So they look for the currency that you've created.
I mean, are governments worried that these currencies could actually end up replacing their currencies? Because, I mean, you mentioned before that they became more popular around the time of the crisis, the financial crisis, when lots and lots of conventional currencies were being printed. And I guess the view was that those currencies like the dollar, sterling, were being debased by the amount that they were being printed. I mean, I've spoken to people who are involved in doing cryptocurrency, and they say, this is the future, precisely because you can limit the amount. That's what will hold the value. The cryptocurrency will hold value, whereas if you print trillions and trillions of dollars, eventually people will say, this thing's not worth anything anymore. Do you think there is any validity in that?
Well, I think firstly, so I wrote a book called The Great Economists, and this idea of privately issued money is not new. It's been discussed for decades. There's no reason necessarily why something which is credible but privately issued and has value to those who want it can't be used as a unit of exchange, which is what money is. So from that basis, cryptocurrencies' rise is something that central banks are looking at and thinking, hang on, if a lot of transactions are being done using cryptocurrencies rather than money that we're issuing, how much control over monetary policy, over the quantity of money in the economy do we still have? So central banks are themselves looking at central bank digital currencies. So China has issued one linked to its central bank. And what that is essentially, many of us use Apple Pay or in some version of digital links to our bank accounts or our credit cards. So a central bank digital currency is very similar. It's essentially, instead of a banknote, it's just like we would use on a banking app. And so that is being looked at by a number of central banks, and that is linked to this idea that central banks would like to see their management of the economy, expanded into the digital space, keeping an eye on digital currencies like cryptocurrencies, though none of those at the moment are large enough to really change the money supply. So one country that's worth looking at is El Salvador, which on the 8th of September has made it compulsory for all businesses to accept Bitcoin alongside the US dollar, which is their national currency they adopted 20 years ago. So it's the first country to make a cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, legal tender, and we'll have to see how that goes.
Yeah, and I believe the UK government is also exploring the idea of set up a task force to look at creating its own digital currency. Is that correct?
I believe so. I believe it, and I would say a good proportion of major central banks are looking at it in various forms. The Bank of Japan is looking at it. So they're looking at it for the reasons that I described, and also some of the technology behind cryptocurrencies are quite interesting for management. So something called blockchain, which is a ledger of these trades of cryptocurrencies. The technology behind it, the ability to register these trades, done through, codes, done through, machine learning. I think that's something that's very interesting for central banks to look at as more and more trades happen, virtually.
I guess the difference between sort of central banks going into this and the sort of the sort of classic cryptocurrencies is the central banks issuing some sort of currency. Something is backing it. Something is behind it. An economy is behind it. Whereas you set up a cryptocurrency, all you're essentially doing is you're creating something that has a value by virtue of the fact that it's so limited. But there's nothing behind Bitcoin in the form of a company or an economy. Is that fair to say?
Well, yes, this is why I mentioned that stablecoin, so something which actually is linked to a government asset, is something which is happening in the cryptocurrency space. But as I was saying a moment ago, I wrote a book on great economists and looking back through history. There's nothing inherently new about privately issued money. You can have privately issued money so long as people are willing to trade it, use it as a store of value, use it to buy things. If people believe it's valuable, then they'll hold on to it and then they'll use it. So, when you have that as the starting point, I think it begins to explain the rise of cryptocurrencies, which are just the digital version of if somebody decided to use privately issued money. I guess, from movies, we see that in prisons, people use cigarettes as a form of money. So it's not anything which has anything that people believe has value and they're willing to use as money, can be used as money.
Is it something we should worry about, though, the rise of cryptocurrencies? Is it something that governments worry about, that it could start to distort economies, that you can't maybe tax it very easily, you can't keep track of it? If companies go bust and they own assets in cryptocurrency, you don't know who has it. I mean, is it something that we should be worried about?
Well, I think that's why central banks are looking at it, because if they grow in popularity as a form of money, then central banks, which look at the quantity of money in order to manage the economy, that's something that would be outside of their control. So, we mentioned El Salvador is using cryptocurrencies as legal tender, and I suppose we'll have to see, how that goes in order to really figure out, if there are issues around visibility. Is it a way of laundering money, because a lot of these transactions, are harder to track. Banks, which watch for money laundering, know your customer, then you don't have that equivalent for cryptocurrencies. And I think that's also why you increasingly are finding that there's talk of regulation in that space to deter crime, to increase some of this visibility, at least, of what the transactions look like. But it is a very fast evolving space, as with lots of innovations. It's going to raise more issues, I'm sure, than what we've just mentioned in due course.
What about businesses? Because some businesses seem to quite like them. Elon Musk famously is more than dabbling with cryptocurrency. How is that working out for him, and are others following his lead?
I can't remember where Tesla got to in terms of accepting, cryptocurrencies. So again, I would go back to El Salvador because the government's mandated that all businesses have to accept cryptocurrencies. And I think the rollout has been a little rocky initially. I think the app went down because the government gave everybody units of cryptocurrency, and I think it crashed the system or something, like that. If a business, they have to in El Salvador, but in other countries, if a business decides that they see cryptocurrencies as valuable, they're willing to accept it and give you a good or service in return, that's really a question for that company, its board, as to why they're doing that and whether or not it is a store of value. Because the other thing about cryptocurrencies is they can be very volatile. What we just described is there's no central bank managing the system. So Bitcoin's value has been extremely volatile over the past year with the pandemic. It's risen rapidly, it's crashed, it's recovered. So if you're using that as a store of value, the value is going to change quite a lot.
Is El Salvador the first government to do this?
Yes.
So everyone will be watching this experiment quite closely.
Yes, absolutely. Because obviously they don't have their own currency. They use the US dollar. They've been using the US dollar for the past 20 years. But the IMF it has issued a warning about whether or not using Bitcoin alongside the US dollar is going to be, it's going to cause volatility in the way that people transact and do business and get paid. So, there's lots of watching of what's happening in El Salvador.
Would you imagine that we're going to see more cryptocurrency be used? I mean, it does seem that their value overall, I know you said it was volatile, but is it fair to say that overall things like Bitcoin have increased in value, which seems to reflect that the market kind of thinks that these things have a future?
Well, I think the proliferation of them, and there's certainly people who are great supporters of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. So there's certainly, I think, demand out there. I don't know how much of it is speculation. I don't know how much of it is, it is growing, and I think that's why we're seeing all of the, especially central banks, thinking whether or not this is a space they ought to be occupying, as opposed to privately issued digital currencies.
I mean, can governments tax cryptocurrencies, or is it pretty tricky?
Governments generally don't tax money, as in...
No, but transactions that are done with using cryptocurrencies. Is it harder to, capital gains through using cryptocurrency? Is it harder to do it if it's a cryptocurrency than if it's a conventional currency?
Well, so let's go back to Tesla. If Tesla were to sell a car and accept cryptocurrencies, as payment, this is going to get slightly complicated because the U.S. doesn't have VAT. There's a sales tax, obviously, in the U.S. based on the state, that the consumer would have to pay on that car, and I would assume they'd have to pay it in U.S. dollars, even if they bought the car in using Bitcoin. So I think the tax thing is going to be complicated for different goods. Some of, as you know, VAT is embedded and sales tax is on top of the price, and differences like that, I think, is going to have to be one of the complications that happens when you have Bitcoin.
So that's something that governments won't like, presumably, if more and more transactions start being done in cryptocurrency.
Well, as I say, I think it's, I don't know if we want to get deep into different tax systems, but it is... if you buy something, you pay the tax on it. It's just a question of, as I say, the complications are just around whether or not it's embedded in the price of the good, whether or not it's on top of the good, and, all the kind of issues. But, you buy things on e-commerce, and if you buy something on Amazon or you buy something on eBay, you're paying a tax on that. So I don't know if this is an area that is easy to generalize. That you're responsible for the tax for when you buy something, basically, and you have to pay it in the legal tender of the country that you owe it to.
All right. I mean, and a final question, which is maybe unfair, but I'll ask it anyway. If someone came to you and said, "You're an economist. Do you think I should be getting some Bitcoin? Do you think I should be buying some cryptocurrency?" Would you have any advice for them?
Well, I am not sure anyone should rely on an economist for investment advice. I think any investment decision, and I think I said this recently as well. It's people who do it full time don't always get it right. So I think anyone who's thinking of dabbling should think very carefully about it. I think it's just like with anything. I think if somebody asks, should I invest in X or Y, I always end up thinking, think carefully, get some professional advice, and probably not from me, an economist, probably from somebody better qualified.
But it is still something. But essentially, a cryptocurrency, you can treat it like a share, or you buy it, you do enough research, you buy it, and hope that it goes up in value. I mean, it's just now become part of the way financial markets and all that world works. That's in itself, I suppose, is a measure of how cryptocurrencies have advanced.
The key difference to bear in mind is that it's not regulated in the same way as if you were to buy a share in a company or put your money in an ISA. So I think that's where it is certainly a riskier area to look at.
Okay, well, that sounds like some good advice to bear in mind at the end of our conversation. Linda Yueh, thanks very much for talking us through cryptocurrencies. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Andy.
Linda Yueh, if you have thoughts on this or ideas for any other podcasts, you can email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting it at AndyBell5News. And please share, rate and review. Thanks for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.